Thank you so much for coming to the Utah State History Conference and for sticking it out through the last session of the day. Our panel today is entitled Diversity and Rights in 20th and 21st Century Utah. And my name is Clint Humphrey, and I've been the manuscript curator at Utah State University's Special Collections and Archives for the last 8 years. And I'm also the reason why you have that little white slip of paper that keeps falling out of your conference program. So I'm sorry about that. At least I can apologize to those here. I just want to start out with some introductory remarks to kind of set the tone for our panel topic and our presenters today. Because of my profession, when I think about this topic of diversity, I think not only about the importance of diversity in the study of history, but also the need for diverse representation and archival resources that are used to write that history. Not just the long view, but the broad view, if you will. You've probably heard the old saying, history is written by the victors, or I guess at least the so-called victors. And this has been historically true for American archives as well. Mainly one group was represented in the records, wealthy white men. At the Society of American Archivists meeting in 1970, however, the historian Howard Zinn challenged this status quo. He reproached archivists and manuscript curators, like myself, for neglecting to collect the records and papers of significant groups in society, some outside the mainstream of American culture. He urged the keepers of records to become activists and to repair the imbalance of their holdings promptly and thoroughly. The idea of the activist archivist has become a particularly influential one over the last decade. Archivists, who often work at state institutions like myself, recognize the legacy of our institutions as the so-called establishment and have emphasized building trust with underrepresented communities as we seek to create a historical record that represents the diversity of our state, region, and nation. Utah State University, where I work, and particularly our folklore curator, Randy Williams, who presented this morning, have worked to make diversity a priority in our collecting, actively engaging with Logan's Latinx and refugee communities, local religious minorities, and participants in Cache County's drug court program, among others. After all, the limited availability of primary source material is often a barrier to a more diverse and inclusive telling of history, and I expect our speakers today probably know that firsthand. Still, we have a lot of work to do. Recently, I was guest speaking at USU's Archives Management class about the topic of archival appraisal. Basically, how do we decide what it is that we collect and what do we reject, and how do we prioritize the processing of those collections? In addition to factors like uniqueness, monetary value, and scholarly importance, I mentioned the representation of underdocumented demographics as an important part of that decision-making process. I have a question, one of the students interjected. My processing project for this class is the records of the Logan business and professional women. It seems they've been sitting on the shelf unprocessed since 1993. If you consider diversity a factor when you prioritize processing, why haven't these been inventoried? Ouch. That was hard to hear. But she was right to point that out. It was a forced moment of self-reflection, and what I learned is that we can always do better. That's why I'm excited to be joined today by our presenters, because they're among those who are helping us to do better. Their presentations represent contributions to often overlooked aspects of Utah history and help move our collective history in a more diverse and inclusive direction. As we hear from them, I would challenge you to reflect upon how you can develop a more diverse understanding and study of Utah history in your own work. So with that in mind, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Sarah Fiek, who will present her paper, The Forgotten Prisoner. Sarah is the visual arts specialist for Carbon School District and visits 5 schools to teach core subjects while integrating art. She has a bachelor's of science in history with a minor in sociology. Her interests are as eclectic as her credentials. She enjoys drawing, riding her motorcycle, crochet, and historical research. She has researched and written about crime and punishment in the West and is in the process of having her paper, Ed McGowan, Justice or Racism, published. Sarah is currently living in Helper, Utah with her husband, 4 children, and 2 dogs. So let's welcome Sarah to the stage.
I live in a place 111 miles from Salt Lake City. You go through Spanish Fork and take Highway 6 through a beautiful canyon to get there. As you travel the canyon, you will notice the geology changing. In Salt Lake, we are in the Basin and Range area, where there are parallel mountain ranges and valleys that formed from the stretching and thickening of the Earth's crust. This kind of geology formed the beautiful mountains you might be used to seeing. But as you travel through the canyon, you cross into a very different landscape. This is the Colorado Plateau region. It is a desert region with plateaus and mesas. It is like living in a movie about the Old West. It is a place I could never have imagined was real before I moved there 3.5 years ago. If you watch the color of the dirt and rocks, it will change from brown to red and green. There are places that you can see layers of white and black, too. The book cliffs start in Carbon County and are made of sandstone. These layers look like books laying on top of the mountains. As you explore these hills, you might notice layers of white stripes. These stripes are an indicator of coal. And I don't know if you guys can see those layers in that picture, but they're there. The coal in the mountains bleaches the dirt below it and leaves a white stripe. A lot of times the coal isn't exposed here because it is burned into the mountain. This can happen when lightning strikes the mountain and ignites the coal. It will burn until the coal burns into the mountain and runs out of oxygen. But the white stripes are an indicator of how prevalent the coal is there. When the immigrant miners came to Carbon County, they were shocked to see seams of coal as thick as 20 feet, when they were used to seams that were only half as thick. It is because of this coal that several boom towns emerged in the area, and Helper became a bustling town of immigrants and outcasts. The location of Helper was strategically chosen as a railroad town, so there would always be a Helper engine ready to assist the coal trains up and out of the canyon. When the coal mines started to take off, the mine companies recruited miners from all over the world. Many of the miners were from Europe. There were miners from everywhere. In fact, Helper had so many immigrants living there that there were once 28 different languages spoken in the town. It was this diversity that brought Japanese immigrants to a club on Main Street and started the course for one man that would lead to an execution date missed. I live up Spring Canyon, and if you drive up there, you can see the remains of the old mining towns. There are foundations of houses, abandoned buildings, and abandoned mine entrances, all visible from the road. The house I live in even came from the old Castlegate town site where Butch Cassidy once robbed a payroll train. This place is full of history, and I love it. I get lost in old documents and photos of people that once lived here. For my capstone project, I was given the theme of crime and punishment from Dr. Neal. I knew I wanted to do something related to the area I lived in, and I wanted to find stories that hadn't been widely told. My capstone project was a grueling crime that took place in the mid-1920s that involved a horrific crime and children. I will not be telling you that story. In fact, it was because of that story that I came across another story, the one I am going to tell you. This story is about a man named Matzah Karmani, and I'm sure that I'm slaughtering that, but that's the best I can do. Karmani was born in Japan in 1870 and immigrated to the United States in 1905. He was a cook and even owned a lunch counter at one time. He spent time in Nebraska, Denver, Cheyenne, and North Platte before coming to Helper, Utah. He felt most comfortable with other Japanese immigrants because he didn't speak very much English. He came to Utah looking for work and used his friendship with the owner of the Japanese Men's Club, Mr. Honda, as a connection. Mr. Honda even lent Karmahi some money for train fare from Salt Lake City. Mr. Honda also gave Karmahi a job as a janitor in his Japanese Men's Club. The Japanese Men's Club was a popular hangout for local Japanese men and some Chinese men. It was in this building that Karmahi met with his ill fate. If you visit Main Street in Helper, you will notice that many of the buildings are very old. In Helper, residents take pride in the history of the town and try to preserve it whenever they can. If you go to the museum, you can view old pictures of Main Street. The cars in the picture might be different today, and the asphalt is different from the gravel road that existed in the 1920s, but the buildings are the same. The landscape and the railroad line are the same that they were almost 100 years ago. It's not hard to imagine what things would have looked like when Karmahi walked these streets. The Japanese Men's Club was a place to drink and gamble with other Japanese men. One of the men that frequented the establishment was Yosuke Ishizaki. Ishizaki worked for the U.S. Fuel Company as a coal miner. He was from Japan, weighed around 200 pounds, and was 54 years old when he died. Ishizaki liked to gamble and was also known to cause trouble. Karmahi and Ishizaki knew each other before they were in Helper. Ishizaki was likely a member of a labor gang recruited by the Hashimoto Labor Agency. These labor gangs would move from job to job as needed. Coal companies built bunkhouses for them and even offered special bathhouses for them because of the Japanese tradition of cleanliness. In Karmahi's testimony, he talked about knowing Ishizaki 12 or 13 years earlier in Nebraska. He was gambling, I was cooking, he said. On March 1st, 1925, there were 10 or 11 people in the Japanese Men's Club. They were playing a gambling game called Chico, also called Fantan. This is a game you played with buttons that had to be divided. On the evening of March 1st, 1925, Ishizaki was playing this game and accused one of the other players of cheating. He then demanded that the buttons be divided again. Ishizaki was so worked up that he was even pounding the table. The other man was Chinese and is referred to in the case court documents as Chinaman. There wasn't any other name. At the accusation, the Chinaman said the word Chanamaka. In this context, Chanamaka is an insult, although I can't tell you the exact meaning. At the insult of Chanamaka, Ishizaki got really mad and was going to fight the Chinaman. It was at this time that the owner of the club, Mr. Honda, stepped in. Mr. Honda was the owner of the Chinese Men's Club in Helper, Utah, and the man that had helped Karmahi by giving him a job. In the trial, Karmahi maintains that the job he was given was as janitor, but the prosecution questions if the job Karmahi was expected to do was that of more of a bouncer for the club, although this part of the story could have been lost in the interpretation of the trial. A janitor is also known as a custodian, and a custodian is a keeper or a guardian. It is possible that Mr. Honda had hired Mr. Karmahi as a guardian for the club. In any case, when Mr. Honda intervened in the argument between Mr. Ishizaki and the Chinaman, Mr. Karmahi also got involved. During the altercation, Ishizaki pushed Karmahi to the ground, stomped on his private parts, and told Karmahi he was going to kill him. Karmahi suffered great pain because of this and blacked out from that pain. When he came to, he fired his gun at Ishizaki. Ishizaki was struck twice in the head with bullets and died from a brain hemorrhage. Dr. R.M. Jones stated his findings during the trial when he said, "Found 2 wounds in the back of the head and one at the inner angle of the left eye." After the shooting, Karmani ran away, fell in the Price River. He was later found soaking wet and hiding from the law. In the 1920s, Americans became more anti-Japanese, passing the Cable Act in 1922, denying American-born Japanese women citizenship if they married Japanese men, even American-born Japanese men. Then, in 1924, the Japanese Exclusion Act was passed, banning immigration of all Japanese people to the United States. During the 1930s, Japanese Americans suffered exclusion and segregation in the social sphere. They were excluded from extracurricular activities and shunned in public. But it was in the 1940s that the Japanese Americans suffered the greatest setback. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans were asked to leave their homes and go live in camps. Unprotected, their property was vandalized and stolen. Many people lost everything they had. It's no wonder Karmani had fled the scene. He may have already been a victim of bigotry and worried about his fate. Matzah Karmani was found guilty of first-degree murder on February 11, 1926. He was sentenced to be executed on April 2, 1926, but was never executed. And this is a picture of the courthouse in Price during that time. Karmani was given a stay of execution on July 18, 1926, when a jury was selected for a trial to determine Karmani's sanity. The court found Karmani needed to be institutionalized and sent him to the state hospital August 12, 1926. In the state of Utah, it is against the law to execute someone that is found insane. Karmani was not found to be insane at the time of his crime, but was found to be insane later while he was in prison. 8 years later, on January 27, 1934, Karmani was found sane and returned to the state prison. It was at that time that the recommendation was given for his sentence to be commuted to a more reasonable prison term instead of an execution, but nothing became of his execution or his life sentence until 1941. In July 1941, Matzah Karmani, who was 70 years old at the time, caught the attention of the Provo Sunday Herald, who wrote an article about the forgotten man. At the time, he was serving a life term by default. Apparently, his appeal from a death sentence was still pending. The article then goes on to talk about how many different attorneys had taken over his case and how many appeals were filed. But it is the appeal that was filed just before Karmani was sent to the state hospital that was still in abeyance. After Karmani was sent back to the prison, the state forgot to name counsel for him. It was also at that time that a new county attorney was elected. When the case wasn't settled, the prison officials released him from death row and put him to work in the kitchen. George A. Carmen, the prison clerk, discovered the unusual status of the small, white-haired Japanese man that never talked but played checkers. Carmen said of Karmani's checker playing that he had become the champion of the prison, and when he wins, he laughs. When he loses, he scowls. He never says anything. After Karmani got noticed again, he was resentenced to death with an execution date of October 14, 1942. Under Utah law, the only way there was to reopen the case was for the courts to dismiss the appeal. The dismissal of the appeal meant that the death penalty would be reinstated. The Attorney General, H. Gills, didn't think there was much likelihood Karmani would be shot. He predicted commutation or pardon. Karmani's attorney was quick to file appeal, and Karmani's sentence was commuted to life in prison on September 23, 1942. That was the biggest win Karmani had experienced in all his time in prison, and all he could say was, "It's fine, fine," and went back to work as a houseboy for the warden. It was pointed out by Karmani's lawyer that there was not an interpreter there for the entire trial. There were only parts of the proceedings interpreted for the judge and jury. Karmani's understanding of the proceedings was not the main goal of the interpreter. Because Karmani was not able to understand and fully participate in his defense due to the language barrier, it was argued that he had not been treated fairly and that the charges should be dropped. Karmani filed for parole in 1942 and 1943 and was denied. Karmani then disappeared from the newspaper for a time after his sentence was commuted. He was then mentioned for the last time in January of 1946 when he was listed as one of the prisoners that was petitioning for parole. In the article, it says that his petition was denied. It is worth noting some of the things that were happening in the United States at the time. As I read the headline, "Forgotten Man Wins Reprieve," I see on the same page a large map with the title, "Three-Way Jap War Threat Hangs Over Siberia." There are places marked on the map for troop threats, air threats, and sea threats. This would have been very upsetting to the people reading this story because it wasn't quite a year after the Pearl Harbor bombing. I would guess that many people wouldn't want a Japanese man accused of murder to be pardoned at that time. Now, taking into consideration the theme of this conference, I wanted to point out the long view of this story. Fear once pushed people to mistreat Japanese people the way we still mistreat minorities today. Stories like Karmani's put into contrast right and wrong in a way that can make it easier to practice the right thing. The right thing was to give the forgotten prisoner his life back. The right thing, even today, is to treat people with decency. The application for termination or parole filed January 2nd, 1946 with the court was the last record I could find for Karmani. I couldn't find a death certificate or anything. I worried that Matzah Karmani had been forgotten in death as he had been in life. Then by chance, I widened my search and found a headstone on findagrave.com. In the picture, it shows the name Matzah Charles Karmani, a Christian name. Perhaps the Catholic Church took him in, or he converted to Christianity after spending so much time in the United States. The headstone is located in North Platte, Nebraska, and says that he died March 1st, 1951. While this is an ongoing project for me, I don't know for sure what happened. I can guess that after World War II ended, Karmani was granted his pardon. I imagine a small, white-haired old man rejoining friends and family in the place he had left just a few weeks before his incarceration. I hope that he lived out the rest of his days in peace and found a place that he would be treated fairly and not be forgotten again.
Thank you, Sarah. Next we have Randell Hoffman in his presentation, The Pride Tour, the need for an LGBTQ+ history walking tour of Salt Lake City. Randell was the landmark chair of the Utah Queer Historical Society from January 2019 to June 2019. While in this capacity, Randell created a walking tour highlighting Salt Lake City's queer history. He was born and raised in the California Bay Area amid rolling hills, walnut trees, and redwoods, and friends who explored Berkeley and San Francisco together. He graduated from BYU, Idaho with a BA in History Education and German Education. He now teaches history outside Nashville, Tennessee, and still continues various research projects on queer history, culture, and pedagogy. Randell?
So, almost every major city has an LGBTQ history walking tour. I was most struck by the one that's in Boston. It's very comprehensive, And it really captured my attention when I was going along their LGBT history, they call it a trail. Different sites that are prominent in that local LGBT history and culture. But I felt that there was something lacking. And at the time I was kind of piqued by this. I realized Salt Lake City didn't have something like this. Surely Salt Lake City had a vibrant, decorative LGBT history that wasn't being highlighted and shown to tourists, to residents, to people who lived there. So I came back from Boston from my vacation, came back to Utah, and I wanted to create a tour that would highlight our unique intersection of queer history and culture, Mormonism, conservative culture, Western movements. That's why I'm so interested in this very specific intersection of Utah history. So I embarked on gathering elements of this tour, things that I could include and tie to physical landmarks and places, events, people, concepts that could all be tied to things that are still around in our visible landscape in Salt Lake City. A note on the Utah Queer Historical Society. So I started this project summer of 2018. And then around that fall, I started meeting with some other local historians and members of the LGBT community in Salt Lake City. And we got together in order to start forming a space where these projects could live, where resources could be shared, that we could make sure that they were being done right, things were being archived and collected properly. So we ended up creating the Utah Queer Historical Society. It's a project of the Utah Pride Center, which is right behind the Smiths, or the Bees ballpark. Lots of different resources there. Sorry, there's a fly. And this Historical Society is one of those new resources that we offer. We're also starting to reach out to different cities and different Pride events to make sure that other histories besides Salt Lake City's is being recorded and preserved. So when we started this Utah Queer Historical Society, I brought my walking tour project to this in the capacity of Landmarks Chair, which was given to me. In conjunction with this year's conference theme, the Pride Tour truly does look at Utah history from a broad view. We examine Mormon settlers entering the Salt Lake Valley all through 2019 with our new hate crime statute that's been edited. We examine local history and culture purely through a queer lens. If you were in my classroom, I would probably put on some fake glasses and show my students that we were looking through a different lens, a different perspective. Something else I want to name here, in this capacity, queer is an okay word. In the past, it's been a derogatory term, but we use it as a term to identify LGBTQ, gender nonconforming, sexuality, gender, all of that kind of under this umbrella term of queer. Too often, a queer theory approach to Utah studies is noticeably absent. You can probably look back on some of the presentations today and notice that there hasn't been a lot of mention of LGBTQ plus issues, topics, and that's something that the Utah Queer Historical Society aims to do is we'll talk about queering space, queering time, really working on making sure that these topics are brought up. And just like what Ms. Fiek did, bringing these things together in this beautiful format to make sure that when we're looking at Utah, that we're fully understanding what Utah looked like in the past and what it currently is by including all those stories that get forgotten. So it is my mission, my goal, to bridge academia and the communities who so desperately need their own history. We have a major issue with suicide in our youth in this state. This is a powerful tool that can be used by educators, by community organizers to reach out to youth and show them that they have a place in history. There are people just like them who came before them. So I was going to include a picture of a bridge, but it's Utah, so there's a bridge for bridge building. During Pride Month, residents new and old came along on the tour. I gave some experimental tours just to see how it was going. And it was really an eye-opening experience to see what these people didn't know about their city, what they already knew about this city and could add to my tour. I also had some people who were brand new to the city, and it was their opportunity to get to know their cultural landscape, get to know some businesses that were around where these buildings are still standing. When I went on that Boston tour, I noticed that there could have been a little bit more. So I built into the Salt Lake Pride tour areas where people can connect to their physical surroundings. Some prompts for people to think about, that's the teacher in me, some prompts for people to think about how they can relate to their physical surroundings. Some points in the tour to stop and reflect. Opportunities to even enter a business, which we'll talk about. So the tour begins, this is the first site, Utah State Capitol Building. This is where we start. I introduce walkers to the broad scope of Utah history, namely through a queer perspective, some of the things that we've been talking about. Early ideas of gender and sexuality that pioneers brought with them. Something that is noticeably absent that I do want to name is a mention of Native American Two-Spirits who were present in the Ute tribe. It's difficult to tie in all of Utah LGBT history because there aren't always physical landmarks. There aren't always buildings where I can tie in these discussions, but I do want to name that these people were around long before any of the pioneers. And I mentioned that as in my description of this first point, this first stopping point. I don't have time to stop at every single point, but just a brief overview of some of the places that we do stop at. I included here a picture. I should have swapped these in the other way. Right after the Capitol building, we go down into City Creek Canyon, Memorial Grove. Memorial Grove and Liberty Park are similar in different ways that we talked about cemeteries at the beginning of this day, if you were ever in that session. And the idea of like going to a park is a whole concept of you can go to this park, you can have this private event, this private space, even though you're sharing it with the public. As you get into the 50s, 60s, 70s, we start developing this idea of queer space. These spaces became queer in that men and women could go on dates to these spaces. You could go and have a picnic with your same-sex date, and people typically aren't going to really look at that. You have your own space there, which creates a queer space. It's a space where you can express yourself in a way that's safe. And I tie this back into the walking tour so that people can also recognize what are other queer spaces? Where are spaces that I feel safe, that I can express myself? Or how can I make certain spaces queer-friendly? How can I work to make sure that these things are accepted and approved? Places like Memory Grove and Liberty Park help introduce walkers and city residents to visit a different time that was completely different, to be redundant, where LGBT people had to live under the wire. Everything was a little bit more hush-hush. They experienced a time when the only way to express your sexuality or attractions was in private, secluded spaces away from the public, away from the police, away from friends and family, and even your churches. And like I said, we begin to define what is a queer space. It's a space that's differentiated from other spaces where queer people cannot genuinely or openly express or identify themselves. Queer spaces are areas, rooms, places that have been altered in order to accommodate the expressions of identities and where norms are no longer enforced or regulated. These spaces become queered If we were to turn it into a verb, where norms are broken, a message of acceptance and tolerance is declared, and a mood is instilled that does not question, mock, or condemn behaviors. All are welcome as they wish to be embraced. And that was very present in Memory Grove and in Liberty Park, which are both features of the walking tour. Walkers and residents are encouraged to focus on what these men and women must have experienced outside these very few and secluded queer spaces. Imagine these are the only spaces, there may have been a few others in your life, where you could genuinely express yourself and feel safe with your chosen family. What does the idea of space mean to them? How should a space feel in order to be inclusive? Hopefully they can walk away knowing how they can queer their own homes, places of employment, for the betterment of all. We allow the work and culture of our own queer ancestors to motivate and inspire us to continue creating a better world. LGBTQ plus history and culture is intrinsically community-based, as we'll come back to at the end of this. There are many reasons for that are still relevant today. One of my most favorite stories that, hopefully I can get through telling the story. One of my most favorite stories that I love sharing on the walking tour is the story of Ava/William McCleary. I think about this last Pride when the Utah Queer Historical Society was able to march in the Pride Parade for the first time, and we all had posters, and we had, I believe it was the image, the one where they are wearing a hat. We had that image of them marching in the Pride Parade, so it was their first time to march in a Pride Parade with us. So it was a really great opportunity. William Ava McCleary was a cobbler right on Main Street, 52 Main Street, which is now City Creek, notably owned by the LDS Church now, which plays into just like an interesting historical narrative. They were a very notable cobbler right downtown, right near Temple Square, very busy area. There was one evening where Ava William McCleary was, they worked mostly as William McCleary in men's dress. They were caught one evening on a trolley car, a streetcar, wearing women's clothing. They were turned to the police, they were reported. The crimes did not quite match what the laws were, which is where the story kind of gets interesting. A Salt Lake Tribune article came out a few days later where they were talking about their gender expression. So they admitted to actually being female. So Ava McCleary admitted to being female, but felt more comfortable working as a cobbler in men's clothes, but was also taken more seriously wearing men's clothes. But as we look at census records moving forward from that, we start seeing Ava/William McCleary kind of flip-flopping between both identities, William and Ava. They started identifying more as Ava, but then once they started to move back into their children's home in the last two census records, they started identifying as William, and their headstone is marked as William McCleary. It's an amazing story to identify to younger generations that there were people like this in history. The notion of people being trans isn't new. There have always been confusions around gender expression, or identity. It's also a really great point to show the power of nomenclature. Back then, there wasn't the idea that you could identify as transgender or as gay, homosexual, or lesbian. These words weren't as popular, or they didn't exist yet. So being able to show a tour walker who might have a similar life experience, that they now have this term that they can use, that they can label their experience, and kind of compartmentalize that a little bit more. It also shows us the intricacies of being an historian. We can't really label Ava William McCleary as trans. That word didn't exist. We don't know if they would have chosen that word. So we have to describe William Ava McCleary in a way that fits the information that has been given to us, which helps us also to interpret history in a more inclusive and appropriate way. Another stopping point is Plumb Alley. There are several back streets, Plumb Alley. I'm all of a sudden blinking on some of the other names, Regent Street. Some of these smaller streets that were part of Chinatown or had laundries, bars, and saloons. There were brothels and places for people to rent beds. These were places that were kind of seedy. A lot of the main residents of Salt Lake City in Utah knew what was happening here, but looked away. The general attitude towards immigrants, towards people that were kind of just lumped together, prostitutes, drunkards, immigrants, homosexuals, were kind of cast into these smaller areas where they could kind of do what they wanted, but weren't looked upon as much. There were definitely police raids in these areas, though, so it wasn't completely true. These are all places that most residents knew about, like I said, but they were very early examples of queer spaces. I wanted to include images of some of the police records that have happened here. There are very interesting descriptions of men who were caught. There's one description of different tattoo markings, which would be another interesting study that I've talked about with some of the other local historians that kind of mark who you were attracted to. There were different kinds of markings, which is kind of interesting to look into maybe what those meant. And then kind of moving forward with history, oh, there are two images there. We get into some more modern history. I have here a picture at Washington Square at Salt Lake City City Hall. Here is a picture of Connell O'Donovan, who is here with us today, leading 91, right? 1991, one of the very first, correct me? This is the second, so the first was 90. Pride marches started up at the Capitol building, went past Temple Square, and ended here at City Hall. Couple hundred people gathered, and this is where our Pride events are still held today at Washington Square, around the City Hall building. In this image, you'll see Connell O'Donovan with his back towards the camera. Everyone else is facing the camera, and their backs are to a group of people. It might be hard to see on this screen, but those people in the very back on the steps of City Hall are waving Nazi flags and are protesting the protesters. This was a very interesting moment where LGBT rights are starting to gain momentum in Salt Lake City. However, it's an example that there's major pushback, but this is the general reaction that Salt Lake City protesters, LGBT protesters were giving to people like these Nazi protesters, turning their back and continuing on with what they knew was important. On this other picture is a more modern picture from the beginning of the year. This is Lizzie's Kitchen, owned by Moody Sveti and Derek Kitchen, who is now a state senator. They notably always hang a pride flag in front of their restaurant at Central 9th, right on 900 South, Harvey Milk Boulevard, which is also a part of our queer culture here. They hang this flag to note that it's a safe space. Everyone is welcome there. A few times just in this last year, it has been cut down. This image was a picture of the pride flag. It was cut before the hate crime laws in Utah had been adapted. In other states with inclusive, appropriate hate crime laws, this would have been a hate crime. Whoever did this would be tried for it, given a punishment. However, at the time, that law was still being debated during our legislative session on Capitol Hill, and this couldn't have been tried as a hate crime law. However, that law was later changed just a month or two after this. So now hate crime laws do include sexuality and gender expression. Looking at this tour in a more broad perspective and why I'm so immensely proud of this project and why I love it so much, it's really a model for community history and how community history projects should be run, not to toot my own horn. But this is a picture of a cover and the back cover of a zine that was made, a little booklet that was made. I posted this link on at the bottom, so you're welcome to copy down this link to a Google Map format of this tour. I posted this on my social media platforms once I was done assembling all of these location tags and descriptions. I posted it online, and I had a lot of really positive support. One friend in particular, without even asking, put together this booklet. He assembled these descriptions, these images, and put together a booklet about the Pride Tour. It was all in order. It was really beautiful. And it's an example of, I feel, what we should be doing with these history projects is putting it into the hands of our community members, especially with LGBT history. We have supported one another and relied on one another for very particular reasons. And I think that should translate into how our history is conducted. It should be within our own community, and we should do that as a collective effort, which I think is so beautiful and amazing. I've had other people come out to support the project in making some virtual reality aspects of the tour. And I've also been working with the Salt Lake City Department of Tourism to get this tour on their website so that we can showcase our amazing and very interesting and different queer history that's in this city. This tour also kind of overlaps with some architectural history, and I was talking to a couple people from Preservation Utah to make a slightly adapted version of the tour that can include some queer architecture, another version of adding queer theory to another discipline of architecture. So like I said, you're welcome to take a picture of that QR code and also write down that link. This is still a project that's in the works. We're still trying to move forward on getting this out to people so that it can be in the hands of people who need this, who need to hear this history. And hopefully, if you're interested, sorry. If you are interested in doing more with the Utah Queer Historical Society, you can find us on Facebook. We have events every month, writing workshops. We collect oral histories. We do oratory events from prominent members of Utah queer history. We're also expanding out to areas like Ogden, St. George, to make sure that those local queer histories are also being preserved as well. Thank you so much.
Great, so we have some time for a few questions, so we'll turn it over to you guys.
You live in Nashville. What brings you back to Salt Lake?
I went to school in Idaho, and then I lived down here in Salt Lake for a few years. Even when I was going to school in Idaho, I had family and friends down here. Came down every other weekend. So Utah is a very special place to me. The only reason I'm in Nashville is because I didn't find a job here in Utah. So I'm in Nashville right now. Maybe I can come back, but Utah history is still something that's very near and dear to me.
This is Randell. Would you, without describing necessarily, would you just tick off 10 or 20 of the sites that are on the tour?
Yeah, we started, pardon? Oh, microphone. So I'll just leave it there. We started the Capitol building. We eventually moved over to, there's a stopping point at Temple Square. There was a notable Kiss-In protest in the early 2000s that happened there. down by Vivint Arena, there were several bookshops and bars that used to be in that area, specifically prior to the 91 tornado. The sun. Pardon? Yes, sorry, I misspoke. And then another point that I forgot to mention, where Ruby Snap Cookies now used to be the Stonewall Resource Center, or the Stonewall Center, which is kind of like a precursor to the Pride Center. There were various resources, book clubs, meetings that happened there. A lot of activist movements came out of the Stonewall Center, so that's a stopping point. Am I missing any? Utah Queer Historical Society? Yes, there's another, I included, you reminded me, I included what is now Moochie's, in kind of close to downtown. It used to be a lesbian co-op bookshop with a lot of notable people who ran that.
You spoke of architecture. What kind of architecture are you talking about?
That is an aspect that is not in my wheelhouse, and I'm going to be working with Preservation Utah to kind of create some overlap there. I do want to use this mapping and tour project to move into trying to preserve and at least tag some of these sites. So like Ruby Snap Cookies, that same building is still around, and it's a very important site in LGBT history in Salt Lake City. And I think that's a site that would do very well in being preserved and at least tagged, and Preservation Utah would be able to help with that.
You're talking about a site. I thought maybe there was some special architecture there.
I'm sure they could add that commentary as well.
Back here.
Yeah, it is.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh.
Can you repeat his question?
He was asking if Helper is like sort of an arts community, and it is. It's definitely up and coming. They're doing a lot to add more art galleries and preserve the buildings downtown and everything. You should definitely come out and see it. It's beautiful what they've done out there.
So what are you going to do about Forgotten Man and Helper? Are we going to be advertising that he was there? Or?
I guess I could go down and talk with the museum, see if we can get something put in there. I don't know. I haven't really thought about it. This is like just something that I was doing.
What was your experience like with the records of the Utah State Hospital?
So my experience with the records with the Utah State Hospital are very limited so far. I am finding out that there are some things that I need to do in order to get more of those records. I'm also hearing that I might not be able to find very much because he didn't speak very much English. And so there may not be a lot that was written down.
Sarah, I'm wondering if he had been released from prison in the early 40s, would he have just ended up like in Topaz?
So his question was if he had been released, if he would have ended up in Topaz. I'm not sure. I'm also not sure. I kind of felt like that the parole board, the reason that they kept denying his applications had to do with the war and what was going on, and people's fear of Japanese people at that time. So I don't think he would have been.
Here.
He asked a really great question. He identified himself as straight, heterosexual, and he asked how to use the word queer. queer is still sometimes used as a derogatory term. When you're referring to someone who identifies as queer, like sometimes I identify as queer, I'm not traditional masculine, as you can tell by what I'm wearing. That would be appropriate, or you can ask someone, like, if you know that they are gay or lesbian, you can ask them, like, oh, like, how do you feel about the word queer? Is that a word that you identify with? I use it mostly in an academic sense when I'm looking at things from a queer perspective. Queer has become a term that just kind of is an umbrella term for all things LGBT alphabet soup. It's just a shorter way of saying not straight, not cisgender, so people who identify exclusively as male, female. Does that help? Yeah. So he knows people, I'm just repeating it so people hear. He knows people who are lesbian, who identify as gay. I have friends who do the same. I've never asked them about that. I've never asked them why they prefer one to the other. But I think that's just something like, keep on your radar. Like if you're talking about someone, know which words they prefer. I can't tell you why. That's something I'm wondering about too.
Sarah?
Yes.
Did you look for a death certificate for him in Nebraska?
Yes, I did look for a death certificate. I'm still in the process of that. The headstone that I did find, I just found like a week or two ago. So I haven't really dug as far into it as I would like. I would love to just like quit my job and, well, I love my job, but I would love to just sit and, dig deeper and deeper and just go down that rabbit hole. And hopefully I will find those answers here soon.
One of the slides had some sort of certificate. What was that?
So the slide that I showed that had the death certificate was for the man that was killed, Ishizaki. So there is a death certificate for that, and there is a headstone in Price, Utah as well. And I should have put a picture of that on there too.
I was just curious if the racial classifications that get up.
Yeah, and
That as a category.
yeah, and I don't know if you've looked at very many census records yourself, but a lot of minority people, if you weren't Caucasian, they put in there like yellow and lots of interesting things that maybe are not PC nowadays. Like you wouldn't refer to somebody like that nowadays, but yeah, that was definitely something that happened a lot.